We'll move into our next session here. And so this is basically a general roundtable discussion of state issues. We do have a few listed here that we'll have some folks kind of kick us off with, but the idea is definitely these are just kind of issues or topics that each of the states have come up with that are of interest to them, and they're kind of looking for, comments and feedback from other states. Have you been experiencing similar issues? Do you have any suggestions, things you've implemented? And so once we get through kind of the ones that are in the agenda, we'll certainly just open it up if there's any other states that want to talk about any particular issues going on in their state that they'd like to get feedback on as well. And so I've asked Captain John Hahn to kick us off here today with some challenges in hemp transportation. Captain Hahn is a 21-year veteran of the Colorado State Patrol, and he is in charge of hazmat enforcement and response across the state of Colorado. He's also a member of the board of directors for CVSA, serving as the current Region 3 president and chair for CVSA's Policy and Regulatory Affairs Committee. Thank you, Captain Hahn.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it for UGPTI for the invite and the opportunity to come and talk for just a little bit about a topic that had gained a significant head of steam prior to COVID. In fact, we had made some progress, and then with COVID as it came along, fell off the table a little bit, but it's one that I can see re-emerging here, and it has to do with the challenges with respect to the transportation of hemp. So real quick, I'm gonna post lunch, we'll get everybody up and running here. So bear with me if we can. If your state, where you're from, has legalized at the state level the cultivation of hemp, just raise your right hand for me and leave it up, okay? If you're at the state level, okay? Kind of look around there, keep your hands up. Now, if your state has legalized marijuana at any level, whether it be recreational or medicinal, raise your other hand. All right, very good. Fair enough. Now look around the room, we got hands up, we got some people. Now here's where it's gonna get real tricky. If your state has legalized, keep your hands up. If your state has legalized recreational marijuana, stand up for me. Just bear with me, right? All right. I'm already standing up, right? Some of you are halfway up. So if you look around the room a little bit, you got some hands up. Some folks have one hand up. Some have two hands up. Some are standing. Some are sitting down with their hands up. Some are all over the place. Some of you are going, dude, what is this all about? It's late. I just had lunch and I don't want to stand up. All right, you can sit down. Thank you. The point there is, if you looked around the room, you saw a lot of stuff going on, hands and people standing up and sitting down and the whole bit. And that's a great way of depicting what you have up here on the screen in front of you. The greatest challenge that we see here is this patchwork of different regulatory realities, different laws across the country. Now, the one that you see there, the upper portion of the screen, that's a depiction of our marijuana laws. Now, I know that my colleague Don Plowman is going to be talking to you about marijuana from his state, so I don't want to go into marijuana, but understand that there is a link between these two. In the lower portion of the screen there, the lower right, you've got the most recent depiction of the states that have legalized hemp at the state level, okay? It doesn't take you too long to realize that there's a whole lot going on across this country as it relates to marijuana and hemp. It's no huge secret that hemp comes from the same place as marijuana, the cannabis plant, right? Cannabis sativa is the plant from which hemp comes. The thing that delineates what is hemp from something that is not, right, is an arbitrary number, which is 0.3% THC content by dry weight. 0.3%. You might ask yourself, well, where does that come from? And it actually came from a dude named Dr. Ernest Small from the 1970s. He authored a paper that looked at cannabis, and he's kind of credited as being the first person to come up with this 0.3%. But admittedly, across the board, it's an arbitrary number. There's not a ton of science behind why 0.3%, at least not that is easily understood within the brain of a state trooper here. So that just kind of highlights for you this different, I want you to think about this patchwork of different realities across the state. Or across the country. I've had some discussions here with a variety of folks throughout the last couple of days, and you hear in some states, well, hemp it's legal to cultivate it, to grow it, and to transport it, but it can't be processed there. And then in some states, it's completely legal across the board. Here in Colorado, that is the case. You can cultivate it, you can process it, you can surely transport it. But it's that disparity across the country that leads us to where we are with the challenges that exist. Because here's the thing, like so many commodities, stuff moves across state lines, right? Just a couple things for you to get your head around the issue a little bit more. Now hemp goes for about $2.50 a pound. I want you to compare that to, a bushel of soybeans. It's $10.90 a pound, or a bushel, which is about 18 cents a pound. It's a $2 billion industry in this country. There was a report that was generated here not long ago. Surveyed 8,000 growers of hemp across the country in 27 states, and the yield was about $8,000 an acre. Again, I'm not an ag person, but if you compare that to other crops, soybeans, potatoes, other things that are grown across this country and ultimately moved across our nation's roadways, it's not hard to imagine why it is that people are getting into that business, because it's lucrative indeed. So, just a little history. I'm not going to get too granular on the history. I said granular for our folks from Texas. Thank you very much. Threw that in there. So a little history for you about hemp. Hemp is not a new thing. In fact, if we want to look back to the first time Congress really started talking about it, we'd look back to 1946. That's where you first started to see some discussion about hemp and what it is and what it's not. Somewhere between there and the 2014 Farm Bill, you have the Controlled Substance Act in 1970 that takes hemp and it makes it a controlled substance. You get to 2014, that also took some time to define what hemp is and allowed for state departments of ag and universities to grow hemp, to produce it for research purposes under a state plan. There's some folks that really jumped headfirst into that reality and started growing it for non-research purposes, which led to this document, the Statement of Principles on Industrial Hemp, that showed up in the Federal Register in 2016. And that was really ag and DEA, FDA weighing in, saying, "Oh, no, hold on. You can only cultivate it up to that point for purposes of research." And then you jump to 2018. The 2018 Farm Bill, and that's where things get a little bit interesting if you're in the business of transportation, or if you're in the business of regulating transportation, if you're in the business of enforcement. What the Farm Bill did in 2018 is it removed hemp from as being a Schedule I controlled substance. It allowed for states to submit a plan to exercise primary regulatory authority. What that meant is, if as a state you decided you wanted to regulate it all on your own in your state, you could do that, and the 2018 Farm Bill allowed for that. Or you could defer to a national plan. You can defer to the guidance put out under USDA. The problem was that there wasn't any guidance at that point. The really interesting one under the 2018 Farm Bill was that it provided states and tribes may not prohibit interstate transportation of it. And you think to yourself, well, okay. Well, that's a mic drop moment. See, it says it right there. States and tribes may not prohibit interstate transportation of hemp. However, as you saw here a moment ago with all the hands up in the air and people standing up and saying all of this, at that point, it was not legal across the country in many states. And to this day, not every state in the country it's legal. Now, this isn't a discussion about hemp is good, hemp is bad. This isn't a discussion about the properties of hemp versus, this is just simply a discussion about the transportation of it. But very definitely, when the 2018 Farm Bill dropped, it created some challenges for those of us in transportation, again, most especially with respect to the prohibition of states and tribes in prohibiting the interstate transportation of it. There was the legal opinion that came from USDA Office of General Counsel. You had the case out of Idaho, the Big Sky Scientific versus Idaho case. That was one in which there was 6,700 pounds that was pulled out of a truck because at the state level it was illegal to cultivate, to possess, right? That ended up leading to a great number of other discussions. And I know some of you probably in this room have had cases in your own states where you've run across truckloads of hemp, and it's led to whatever enforcement action. You can't see because you've got there at the very bottom. Maybe I should pause. Right there at the bottom. So there was an interim final rule that dropped, interestingly enough, on Halloween of 2019. And it was with that everybody kind of sat around with bated breath, the folks that were trying to track this issue, to see what sort of information would come out in the final rule. And you may not be surprised to know that the word transportation was listed a dozen times in the interim final rule. And what it did is it just recapped once again the fact that states may not prohibit the interstate transportation of it. Did not provide a heck of a lot of clarity, quite frankly. And so how it is that I got involved in the issue is one, through CVSA. CVSA put together a working group that I currently head up. We met, in fact, just last week. What our focus was, both CVSA and then my involvement in a local group here in Colorado, the Colorado Hemp Advancement Management Plan, or CHAMP. That's a statewide initiative that was initiated by our governor here in Colorado to assemble a group of stakeholders from seed to production and everywhere in between, to include transportation, to look at the issue across the spectrum of everybody that's going to touch this, and to come up with a series of recommendations. And it was a series of recommendations in anticipation of the interim final rule coming out. Now, it's interesting when you're in that group and you walk in a law enforcement uniform, it turns heads. I'll tell you, that was an interesting couple of meetings. But what came out of that group of meetings that we had with the CHAMP initiative and out of CVSA was really what you see up on the board there. Across the board, you had enforcement, both locally and across the U.S., that had the same thoughts and concerns about it. Again, not a discussion about whether should hemp be legal, should it not, whatever. That's a discussion for a different day. Fact of the matter is, as a matter of federal law, it's legal, right? So this kind of summarizes what our set of comments were that were ultimately provided by CVSA through its board of directors on the interim final rule, and then also helped guide here at the state level what our comments were. And really what it amounted to was this, was the need for requirements for how a load is certified to meet THC levels prior to transportation. A need for uniform documentation to be presented at roadside. That's a key one that we came back to over and over again. The need for uniform documentation to be presented at roadside, because you know what? If you go back a slide or two, not to back up on you, but if I go back a slide or two and you look at that picture that's in the middle of the screen there toward the bottom, one of them is hemp, one of them is marijuana. Who can tell me which is which? Raise your hands. That's very good. That's good. You always want to know your crowd. I wanted to know who it was that I was playing with here today. So the one on the left, by the way, is hemp and not marijuana. But if you had a young state trooper, port of entry officer, whomever, for whom the blue flame burns bright, and they stopped a load of something that looked like that, if you think back to the beginnings of your career, it probably would have gotten your heart pumping a little bit. So this over and over again, this need emerged. It became pretty clear that there is a need for some sort of uniform documentation for specific packaging and labeling requirements and requirements for the sealing of the load. Those were the bullets that came up over and over again as we had these discussions. Those comments were submitted in response to the IFR. So you fast forward now to the beginning of this year. We got through COVID. Hemp kind of fell off the radar screen A final rule was published in the Federal Register in January of this year, went into effect on March 22nd. And there's a lot in there. It's a 96-page document. I would encourage you to sit down and cuddle up with it some night in front of a fire. There's a couple things in there that are important. Regulations related to approval and state plans, that's an important one for the folks that are in that business. Let's see, providing requirements for records retention and disposal of non-compliant plants. By the way, that bullet number 3 up there, in the interim rule, in the IFR, there was a requirement for non-compliant plants that are above that 0.3% level, right? For them to have to dispose of those, for the grower to have to dispose of those. It put that requirement on local law enforcement. Now, I don't know how many of you in here that are in a law enforcement agency have the capacity to take on a bunch of non-compliant plants and put them somewhere. I can tell you my agency doesn't have that capability, so that also drove some of our comments. It established a 1% negligent violation threshold. Probably the most important thing that came out of it were there were some recommendations. And here they are. I would say that the comments that were offered on behalf of our enforcement community were largely echoed in that document in the final rule, but didn't go as far as to establish them as under the rule of law, but rather provided under a series of recommendations. And there they are. That's my second bullet point up there. USDA specifically provides recommendations in the documentation for transporters to carry copies of the producer's license. So at the state level, whatever that document is that your state Department of Ag says, yes, this grower meets the requirements, copies of lab testing reports, a bill of lading, and contact information for buyer and seller. That's directly out of the final rule. Does not address the labeling and packaging or sealing of loads comments that were sent. But I think it really does get to the heart of it, which is that need for documentation that helps the officer at roadside to determine the legitimacy of that load. Think about it in this way. With hazardous materials, a hazmat truck has to have what, right? It's got to have some documentation on board. It's got to have a shipping paper to determine what that is. And what does that tell you? Well, it tells you what's in the truck. It tells you a quantity of what's in the truck, and it gives that officer on the side of the road a good first blush stab at whether or not what they're seeing is legit. Now, do we know exactly what's in there? Sure, it could say that it's gasoline and it could be diesel, or it could be gasoline and it could be something else in there. The reality is that documentation that is needed at roadside is of critical importance to our officers, and it certainly is here. That's something that I've tried to drive home with my staff. But it does not adopt any requirements beyond just recommendations, and the problem there, at the heart of the problem, is that there's not anything within those recommendations that's enforceable under law. The other thing that the final rule does is it specifically spells out the lack of jurisdiction on the matter. USDA is not adding transportation paperwork requirements to this rule because it does not have jurisdiction over common carriers or other types of transporters. So they're specifically asserting the fact, despite those comments that came from a lot of people from across the country, to add some sort of documentation, paperwork requirements, they did not incorporate those into law. So next steps, under consideration is petitioning for rulemaking to incorporate USDA recommendations. Nothing final on that. But as a best practice, and this is what we struggle with here. We've got a great relationship with our state trucking association, the Colorado Motor Carrier Association. In fact, some of the members of CMCA are sitting in this room here and are good friends of ours. We worked closely with them pre-COVID to try to come up with a set of recommendations. So if a hemp truck is moving at least within the bounds of the state of Colorado, is there any sort of guidance that we can provide them as a best practice in order to do it? Because here's the reality. With, as I said to start my comments today, with a $2 billion industry, it's going from field to production. It's getting there somehow. And so here's the touch to safety, right? It's getting there somehow. Is it the 18-year-old in a Penske truck that just loads it full of super sacks and heads down the road? Is it carriers that maybe not make everybody's radar screen that's hauling that product? We don't know. I think you can let your imagination run wild. But I can tell you almost surely a field worth of hemp is not getting to a production facility in the back of a Honda Civic. It's getting there somehow. And that should, I think, cause us some concern. Again, a lack of clear guidance that we can provide, not just to our officers, and point back to law, but also what guidance can we provide the industry. And so this is taken again right out of the recommendations and will really guide our comments moving forward here, as it's at very least recommendations out of the final rule. And the most important thing there is to engage with partners in the enforcement industry. Engage with others. If you haven't already, if you don't know the issue in your state, I would encourage you to do so. If you don't know exactly what your law is in your state, I would encourage you to do so. If you haven't talked to your Department of Ag, if you haven't talked to your state trucking association, I would encourage you to do so. Because, I mean, really what it comes down to, again, is that case of the truck at 2 o'clock in the morning that's pulled over and an officer trying to figure out what in the world to do with it. So that is where I guess we can open it for some questions. And I'm also looking for some comments as we continue to tackle the issue. I know this is something that's maybe not right in the middle of everybody's radar screen as we're talking about hours of service and we're talking about all of these other things that touch this industry and touch our place within it. But I'm also interested to know, from a comment standpoint, how it is that you treat that particular product within your states.
Good morning. I'm from South Dakota. My name's John Brors. We do have legalized hemp in South Dakota now. And one of the concerns we had was the lab testing reports and the validity of those. So if Matt decided, hey, I'm a laboratory now, and I can tell that hemp is 0.3 just by looking at it, it might be 48%, but it's, I'm sure, trust me. And so most of I think it's the federal plan says it has to be a DEA certified lab. Well, I asked DEA for a list of the labs or a link to the information. So a roadside officer could look it up and say, yep, Matt's lab is actually DEA certified, not just his guesstimate. And they currently don't have a list. Part of the final rule was that they had until January of 2022 to have a certification process. So right now, just the labs that the DEA does have, it's a self-certified portion for the labs. And DEA is going through, I don't know if it's a testing process that they do with the labs, but right now the list that DEA has is just folks that say, sure, we can tell what level THC is on it. And they're hoping to have something sooner rather than later. He's hoping to have next week for the ones that the DEA has cleared. A list of those, but until January 2022, it's just folks that say they can tell, if that helps anyone.
No, and thank you. And I think that, yeah, that I think more highlights the issue, just some of that uncertainty. But I think everything's working in the appropriate direction. What scares me is that interim between now and then. On what happens. Is it a certified lab? What does it look like? You know, something as simple as, you know, we've seen it in silage trucks. We've seen it in super sacks. We've seen little pellets that look like they're out of a Traeger. We've seen it in so many different forms. There's also a strong educational component to this that I think is awfully important, but it's hard to get there to educate folks when you don't have, to this day, still anything solid in terms of transportation requirements.
Does anyone else have any comments? Dustin, has there been anything come online?
There has not.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. I think you're good.
All right.
Thank
very
you for
well.
that update. Appreciate it.
You bet.